Hi, my name is Dan Courtney. This is my second response to Beetle Man on the subject of God and power. Now, Beetle Man's second rebuttal to me, he claims that this discussion hinges on two different kinds of monism. Monism being a belief that there is a single fundamental nature of reality. He says,
Dan believes that everything in reality boils down to the material world and its constituent parts, subatomic particles and the like.
Actually, this isn't quite true. Now, whether subatomic particles are in fact the most fundamental aspect of reality is an interesting question, and one in which I don't presume to know the answer. Now, some physicists, like the late Victor Stenger, argue that there is a limited set of subatomic particles, and these are in fact fundamental. Others, for example those advancing string theory, contend that subatomic particles are actually the result of tiny one-dimensional vibrating strings, while others, Beetle Man being included, suggest that matter itself is somehow illusory and that what he calls structures are actually fundamental. I think by structures he's referring to some type of conceptual relationship, although I confess I do not fully understand the term. The point I would like to make is that before I accept that subatomic particles are in fact derivatives of some more fundamental aspect of reality, I would like to have some empirical evidence. Now, string theorists admit that although they have constructed elegant models using their theory, they do not have empirical evidence to support their theory, and thus none that I know of are putting string theory forward as anything other than a possibility at this point. Now, Beetle Man contends that the notion of anti-realism, or structures as being fundamental, avoids the problems of materialism, and thus it is the preferred option. I'll take Beetle Man at his word that anti-realism presents a model that avoids some of the problems of materialism. I simply don't know enough about it to reject it. But like string theory, I'm not aware of any empirical evidence that supports the model of anti-realism, and therefore it would be premature to accept it. On my original point, that a timeless and immaterial God cannot be powerful, as in power being work over time, Beetle Man and I seem to agree that given a dualistic notion of reality, this cannot be the case. Frank Turek, the Christian apologist that I was initially critiquing, is a dualist, and therefore I think I'm safe in saying that Beetle Man and I both agree that this characterization of God as timeless, immaterial, and powerful, operating in a physical world, is not rational. Now, where Beetle Man and I diverge, however, is that he does not believe that my critique addresses his notion of God, given his anti-realist position. But here is where I believe Beetle Man is making an error. Whether he is correct or not about there being a more fundamental aspect of reality beyond the material is irrelevant, because our model of reality in which power equals work over time is still valid. In other words, the relationship between power, time, and mass still holds regardless of whether time and mass can be further reduced to non-physical structures. Let's look at an example. 1 plus 1 equals 2. The numbers are conceptual representatives of some aspect of reality, and the equation represents a model of that reality. Now, a materialist may say that this equation could be expressed as brick plus brick equals bricks. What Beetle Man contends, however, is that a brick as a material object is in fact not physical, but is simply a mental construct based upon some type of structure. Same thing for the string theorist, who says that the fundamental nature of the brick is one-dimensional vibrating strings. So let's say string theory is correct. Does this mean that 1 plus 1 equals 2 is no longer a valid representation of reality? No. The relationship still matches the evidence, even if the brick can be further reduced to something more basic. The same thing with anti-realism. Even if we conceive of the brick as having a more fundamental nature, the relationship of 1 plus 1 equaling 2 is still borne out. So when I say that a timeless and immaterial God is not compatible with a God who is also powerful, in the sense of performing work over time, then it doesn't matter whether mass and time are reducible to structures, because the relationship of power to work and time is still valid. And God has been, by Frank Turek's original definition, excluded from that relationship. Now, Beetle Man also presents an example of different animals running into a table, and he explains how the animals, from humans to flies, have a different subjective experience of bouncing off the table. Well, I'm sure they do, but this subjective experience has nothing to do with our objective expression of the physics of the incident. Again, whether the fly, the human, or the table are fundamentally material, or whether they're structures, the impact on the table can be described in terms of mass and acceleration. If mass is in fact a manifestation of a more fundamental structure, then fine, but God cannot share the same structure if he's immaterial and massless, and therefore God cannot be said to impact the table. Now, Beetle Man has also suggested that I have three options. First, only apply my analysis to dualism. Second, refute his definition of power. And third, defend the idea that materialism is in fact fundamental. On only applying my analysis to dualism, we agree that it does score a direct hit. But Beetle Man doesn't seem to object to me applying the analysis to materialism. It's just that he doesn't believe materialism is valid. So from a materialist perspective, the analysis would still seem to hit the mark for both of us. But from a structuralist perspective, Beetle Man isn't willing to recognize that the analysis is valid because it relies on a description of a physical interaction irrespective of whether there is a more fundamental reality. As far as refuting his definition of power, well, Beetle Man didn't actually deny the definition of power as work over time, but rather suggested an additional definition of power as influence. Well, yes, words can have more than one meaning, and power is no exception. But as I argued in my previous rebuttal, the concept of power as influence is not what Frank Turek was advocating, and not apparently what Beetle Man is limiting his idea of power to either. And finally, defending the notion of materialism as fundamental. Well, as I hope should be clear by now, it simply isn't necessary. And similarly, it isn't necessary for Beetle Man to present his reasons for holding a structuralist ontology of reality, because he isn't refuting the relationship expressed in the equation for power. Finally, Beetle Man agrees that minds correlate to brains. He said, quote, "I don't think the mind is just floating out there in the ether," unquote. But I'm not arguing that it's just a correlation, but that the mind corresponds with the brain, or at least the function of the brain. So if God is said to be a mind, then what or where is the brain with which it corresponds? If there is none, then isn't Beetle Man in fact saying that there is a mind floating out there in the ether? So, summing up my rebuttal. First, I'm not a strict materialist, but rather I'm open to the idea that what we perceive as a fundamental material existence is in fact a manifestation of something more fundamental. But it's not clear what the more fundamental nature might be, or even whether we might ever be able to know it. Second, power as the relationship between time and mass still holds as a model of reality, regardless of whether time and mass can be further reduced to non-physical structures. And thirdly, claiming that God does not manifest time or mass excludes God from being powerful in regards to the relationship between time and mass. So, my original claim stands. A timeless and immaterial God cannot rationally be considered powerful. Thanks.